Trauma. Everyone has it. No one talks about it. It seems easier to stay silent, ignore it, or stuff it than it does to honor it, learn from it, and finally heal. Trauma is debilitating, yet so often we suffer in silence. Trauma is not meant to be battled alone, and we are no longer going to suffer in silence. Together, we are creating a safe place to speak, to share our stories, and grow our strength as we heal. Together, we are giving a voice to those who have been silenced, bringing darkness into light, and letting God use our stories. Today, we find ourselves again. We relight our spark and let it light up the world. Stop SIS is a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating on issues of trauma and trafficking, as well as the amazing power of the healing journey. Welcome to Stop SIS. Big welcome back to Stop SIS, Stop Suffering in Silence. My name is Denise Walsh, and I am here with co-host Rachel Timothy. And today we have a really special guest. Our guest in 2011, his sister actually confided in him that she had been abused when she was a young child by their father. Their father was a former minister of 27 years. Our guest immediately reported his father to the authorities, which resulted in his confession of 23 victims and a conviction of 30 to 60 years in Pennsylvania State Corrections Facility. He now researches deception techniques of child molesters and specializes in abuse in plain sight. He is a full-time minister, the author of a #1 new release, The Devil Inside: How My Minister Father Molested Kids in Our Home and Church for Decades and How I Finally Stopped Him. Our guest is a speaker, abuse advocate, and his mom, Clara, and him host a weekly podcast called the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. As you can see, we are honored to have him here to talk with us about his experience. Big Stop SIS welcome to Jimmy Hinton.
Yay. Thank you, Denise and Rachel. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here with you guys.
Well, Jimmy, Rachel referred me to your podcast when I started working with her. And what I so appreciate about you and your mom, Clara, is that you talk candidly about the abuse, about the problems, about how it kept happening, about grooming, all the things.
Sure.
And so we knew that we wanted to connect with you, pick your brain, and introduce you to our audience as well, because you have a powerful story, not just of the abuse that happened within your own home, but also the action that took place once it was brought to light. So
yeah,
why don't we just start with tell us more. How did this happen?
Yeah. So, we grew up in a very small town, actually a huge, we landed on the map on September 11th, 2001. I grew up in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, a town of 230 people. There's no stoplight, it's like this tiny little town in the middle of nowhere. And, we were like the picture perfect family. Everybody knew us. We knew everybody else, small community, tight knit community. And, by all measures, I guess, we had a really happy, normal upbringing, or so we thought. And, I think for people looking from the outside in, we were kind of like the model family that everybody got along. I'm right in the middle. I'm the middle child of 11 siblings, or 11 children. So I have 10 siblings, 5 older, 5 younger. And we were very, very close and still are. So I ended up, I sat at the feet of my dad and his preaching for, all of my life until I went to college. And then I went off to college. I graduated early, went to college at the ripe, barely young age of 17. And I went into a Bible degree. I ended up after a while, decided I was going to do my MDiv. So I went to seminary. I took a year off in between, went to seminary, graduated in '07, and my wife and I moved up here to Pennsylvania, kind of as a stopping place till we figured out what we wanted to be when we grow up. Actually, what brought us back to my hometown was my mom and dad were separated. They were recently separated, and it had nothing to do with sexual abuse because we didn't know at that time. And I was very close to my dad, so I felt horrible for him. My wife and I actually took him in as soon as we moved up here. For 2 years, he lived with us. And at the end of that 2 years, my wife had had enough of him, and she just started seeing really manipulative things that he was doing. And she was pointing those things out to me. Again, nothing to do with sexual abuse, but she just saw things that were really put a wedge between her and him. And so we ended up buying a house in '09. 2 years later, that same year, sorry, in 2009, I ended up getting hired at the church that my dad preached at for 27 years. So my home church, and I'm still there to this day. So that was in June of '09. 2 years later, in July of 2011, my youngest sister, Alex, comes to me, and she said that she was sexually abused by him when she was a child. She was 20 years old whenever she disclosed it to me. And it completely, I mean, that one 20-minute conversation / meeting that we had together changed our world forever. I talked to Mom really quickly after that, and her and I kind of put our heads together, and Mom was in the know too. And I mean, this was literally probably 2 hours before I had a wedding rehearsal for one of my church members. So it was just like this wild range of emotions was just raging that weekend. And so we made it through the weekend. I ended up preaching on Sunday. My dad was sitting like 2 rows back in this really small church, sitting beside my sister, Alex. And Monday morning, as soon as our local police department opened up, Mom and I were inside the police department reporting him. So, I mean, this all happened really, really quickly. And, a whole series of unfortunate events unfolded. But in the end, we got the justice that everybody needed. And he ended up in 2012, 4 days before Father's Day. He was sentenced essentially to a life sentence in prison. He was given a 30 to 60 year sentence with a 30-year mandatory minimum. So he has to serve 30 years before he's eligible for parole. So he worked very hard to get where he's at. And we're thankful. We're very, very grateful that he's in prison.
Yeah, no doubt.
One question I have is, was there any part of you that did not believe your sister, or what made you go, this has to be true?
Yeah.
There was absolutely no part of me that believed that it wasn't true. There was a huge part of me that didn't want to believe that it was true.
Right.
But there was no part of me that thought that she was either misremembering things or and certainly not making things up. I mean, that didn't even entertain my thought process for a minute. But the way I describe it, and I think I wrote about this in my book a little bit, but it was like this flood of probably thousands of memories that just came to my mind in a fraction of a second. That was like, holy crap, now it makes sense. Like all the oddities, all the weird things that we kind of just brushed off. And nothing that was really major, nothing that certainly, obviously, it was never cause enough for concern that we ever thought about reporting him before or suspecting that he was sexually assaulting children. But it was just oddities, strange things like, I can give a couple examples, but like bringing silly string to church and taking little kids and, they disappear for a little bit. Then they come out and the kids are covered in silly string, things like that were just kind of odd, but was like things that you can brush off and you're like, oh, well, he's being immature, and he's doing things that kids love to do. Kids love silly string. So it's things like that. But all those things started flooding my memory bank, and I was like, holy cow, this makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Do you feel like, so it was basically the red flags that all of a sudden you had brushed aside because you thought you knew him.
For sure.
Now it's like, okay.
And I was best friends with him. It's not just that I knew him and, was his son. And, I would say out of all 11 of us kids, I was probably the very closest to him. And so, not only was he my father, but he was my best friend too. And so there was just, so many losses all at once. And an immediate identity crisis all at once.
Wow. Can you explain to me, like, what were your words to your sister?
I remember very clearly the first thing I said to her is, I believe you.
Wow.
She was kind of sitting in just a pile of her own sorrow and embarrassment and shame and all the things that sexual abuse bring to victims. And, she had her head kind of in her arms, and she was sitting across my desk from me in my office at the church, and she's just sobbing. And I said, Alex, I believe you. And the next thing I said is, I have no idea what's going to happen from here on out. I was like, I really don't know. Like so many unknowns. And this was the first time ever that I had any experience with sexual abuse or any conversation about it. In 9 years of undergraduate and graduate school, not once was sexual abuse of minor children ever mentioned once. Never.
Right.
So this was literally my first experience ever with it. And I said, I don't know what the future holds, but I said, Alex, there's one thing that I can promise you as your brother. I can promise you this. It stops now.
Wow. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I can't imagine just how relieved that made her feel. I recently spoke at a high school, and a girl came forward to me sharing about an abuse that was happening within her house. And she carried the burden that she would be the one separating the family, like breaking the family up if she said something.
Absolutely. And that's a burden that victims should not ever bear. And that was, I don't know, I can't say that this was part of my thought process, that I was somehow taking that burden away from Alex, but I didn't care at that point. Honest to God, like I said, Dad was my absolute best friend. Up to that point, we had zero reason ever to suspect that he was guilty of any of these crimes, or we would have stopped it a long time ago. But I didn't care at that point. I was like, all right, the stakes just went through the universe. The stakes are that high right now. I literally don't care. I'm going to do what's right. And Mom and I talked. It was a very quick conversation too. And we've gone back and we talked about this, and we've talked about this in podcast episodes. We never entertained any option other than going to the police, period. There was never any like debating, like, what should we do? Should we talk to other people and see if they had experiences with him? That was never part of our conversation. Our conversation was, I said to Mom, you know exactly what we need to do. And she said, you tell me when, I'll be at your house. We'll go to the police department together. That was our conversation, period.
And did your church family support you guys in this?
100%. 100%. They didn't really have a choice because
right.
we reported it before I ever said anything to the church. I mean, it was Alex talked to me on a Friday. On Monday morning, Mom and I were in the police department.
Yeah.
So they didn't have a choice, but yeah, they were fully supportive.
Good. And again, like another situation I've been involved in with a lady who was sexually abused by her pastor, the church was saying, but he has so many other good fruits. We shouldn't put him in jail.
This is kind of an interesting thing. I mean, I get so irritated. Oh my gosh.
Which is why we love you.
You're going to make me like come through the computer screen. I hate that reasoning. I understand it, but I hate it. Because I remember Mary DeMuth, who she's a good friend of mine. She's a fantastic author. She's a sexual abuse survivor. She wrote an article several years ago, a blog post called "Poop Brownies," and she's like, just using that analogy, and she's like, all right, if you put all of the ingredients to make brownies together and mix them up in a bowl, and you make 2% of that poop. You take fecal matter and put that inside the brownies. You can't say, yeah, but 98% of the brownies are good. She's like, it's been tainted, it's been ruined. And she's like, this is what abuse is. It's not like a misstep. It's not what you and I wrestle with self-destruction, self-destructive behavior, with temptations, with really wrestling with that and having these guilt battles back and forth, and we do something and we feel crappy about it and we lose sleep and we're like, oh my gosh, I hope nobody finds out. Like, that's not what this is. What they do is absolutely planned out. It's meticulous. They think about it, they live and breathe it, and they will not stop until they produce more victims, period. I've been researching this for 10 years. They do not, cannot, and will not ever stop. They don't do it.
Yeah, I think oftentimes people think of that story of, cast the stone. If you've not sinned, then you are allowed to cast the stone. And so
Yep.
nobody feels like, well, their sin's the same as my sin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that doesn't work for this. And until you're abused by somebody, or you're able to study somebody up close like I am, and you're able to see all these little intricacies. And I did an interview with with Judge Aquilina, from Larry Nassar's judge who sentenced him. It was phenomenal. And she's like, what you saw on TV was a fraction of what, excuse me, what me and his victim saw in the courtroom. She's like, him rolling his eyes, him sitting there like playing tic-tac-toe, like bored to tears in that courtroom. She's like, we saw all of that. And she's like, there's no remorse whatsoever.
Right.
There's fake remorse, but
Right.
she's like, he wasn't sorry for what he did. And she's like, that was crystal clear in that courtroom. Until you've witnessed that, all of us, especially within the Christian community, we want to believe that everybody's like you and I.
Yeah.
That everybody has a good heart somewhere in there. And you'll even hear Christians say that. They're like, somewhere in there, there's a little glimmer of goodness, and we just have to kind of nurture that inside of people. I'm like, no, there's some people who there's just a freaking black hole inside of them. They're dead inside. And they look really good on the outside, and they're so incredibly good at manipulating people because that's all they do. All they know is deception.
Right.
And so there's the appearance of good, but that's why we have to actually look at the fruit and, kind of cut it open. And Mom and I did, we did some episodes on that where you actually cut the fruit open. It might look good on the outside, but until you cut it open and dissect it and start looking into somebody's heart, all you're going to see is what's on the outside. And you're like, yep, looks good to me,
Right.
And for a lot of people, it's not.
Right. And it's hard because when all you see is the outside. So for like you, all you saw was your dad's outside, but your
Yeah.
sister was seeing the heart.
Yes.
The victim
Yes.
will see the wolf, and
Yes.
everybody else will see a sheep. And
Mhm.
so it's hard to say that you're going to judge somebody's heart when you've never been given evidence of what that actually looks like.
Yeah, I think the other part too, I've written about this quite a bit. Like, we don't know, in the church, we've not been taught how to make a distinction between sheep and wolves. There's a crystal clear distinction in the Bible. Like, it does not get for me, it doesn't get any more black and white than what Scripture lays out. And when I talk about wolves, I'm saying when a wolf is being described in Scripture, it's not describing behaviors. It's not describing what they do. It's describing who they are.
Right.
And wolves are not sheep. At the end of the day, like, you can put a sheep cover on them, you can shave the sheep and, drape wool over them, but in the end, a wolf is a wolf. And so the Bible, when it speaks in these terms, always the underlying message is run from them, get away, avoid such people. Like, that language is so black and white in the Bible, and yet in the church, we're like, oh, the 99, Jesus left the 99 and he went to rescue the one sheep. And so we should do the same for this stumbling brother. And I'm like, first of all, you've got to determine who's a sheep and who's a wolf, and do it unapologetically. That's part of the other problem. We've been programmed as Christians to not be too judgy, to not come off as being too harsh, to, even if somebody's an enemy to us, to kill them with kindness, to, heap burning coals on their head. And all this stuff is taken so out of context. And I'm like, it is destroying not just the church, but it's destroying innocent people's lives, literally.
Can you tell us a bit about how the other victims started to come forward once this was opened up?
Yeah. So Alex was 20 years old whenever she came to me. And Alex, what happened with her is, and she's spoken on the podcast about this. So I'm going to clarify that and just let people know, like, I'm not speaking about things that Alex herself hasn't very publicly spoken about. She didn't remember almost anything from her childhood. I mean, good or bad. Like, she just had very few memories of her childhood, and certainly none of the abuse. But she found herself chronically depressed. She went off to college. She was, suicidal, just really, really struggling. And then she saw my dad with these little sisters that he was babysitting. And that was from another church here in town. And it just she started getting flashes. She started remembering certain details. And it was just like mannerisms and the way he touched them, the way he interacted with them. Not sexual abuse, just certain mannerisms started triggering memories for her. And not real vivid memories, but enough that she knew in her heart of hearts that he was sexually abusing those little girls. That's what prompted her to come talk to me. After I reported, it happened pretty quickly, but there were other siblings of mine who started coming forward to me. And I think it's because they knew there was validation there. They knew that they knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that I believed Alex. And so I would believe them. And so they started talking about sexual abuse. And then at that point I was like, holy cow, this is huge. This is absolutely colossal. And then when Mom and I reported it, we went into the police station, a few days later. I remember Ruthie Beckner, and she's, Detective Beckner. She is a great family friend. We've gotten very close after this, especially. But I remember her telling me, like, Jimmy and Clara, brace yourselves, because I'm telling you, he will have a lot of victims. And she's like, I've been investigating sex crimes for decades. And she's like, I know from what little bit you guys are telling me, he's going to have a lot of victims. And so you better just prepare for it. And she was right. So he confessed to 23 victims. But since he was sentenced, we've had, tons of people who are not part of the 23 that he confessed to, who've spoken to us and said that they were victims of his too. So, we think very easily he had victims well into the hundreds. Wow. Easily.
Can you share with us what it was like then going into the prison and having a conversation with your dad?
Yeah, so he was in county jail for the first, 11 months before he was sentenced. And I visited him every single week. Once a week, I visited him in person. And I don't think if I missed a week, it's maybe one or two out of the whole 11 months. And I guess a big part of that, looking back, was curiosity. He didn't know that Mom and I had reported him until literally probably 4 or 5 days before his sentencing. And he found that out through his discovery package. He read the entire discovery package. It was like 1,000 pages, 1,000+ pages. And that was the one thing that he obsessed about, not his victims. I don't think he ever mentioned his victims in that whole 11 months. And for me, that was pretty telling.
Even his daughters.
What's that?
Even his daughters.
Right. Exactly right. It was all like
for those who don't know, the discovery is a part of the legal system, right? It's the discovery is what the plaintiffs give to the defendant, so they all kind of know what the other person is going to prepare.
And this is not to scare anybody out of reporting, because I think a lot of things are redacted, but I mean, this includes all the conversations between people and the police. It includes everything. So that's how he discovered, through this discovery package, which is an inmate's right. By law, they have the right to get this entire discovery package. And so, of course, the photos were redacted, all the photos that he had taken, that kind of evidence, which I found out later he demanded. He said, and his logic was, well, if you're withholding pictures and videos that I took from the discovery package, what else are you hiding? And so it shows you where his mind was. He wanted to view those pictures and photos again. So, I don't know, like, I guess the only way I can describe my visits with him is really, I guess one word, twisted. Really bizarre, because he was manipulating me, I was manipulating him. And that continued when he went to prison, for years. Now our communication has really trickled down to almost nothing. But I mean, for years, we were writing each other back and forth every single week, at least once a week.
And were you, it sounds like you had the goal of really wanting to try to understand and get into his mind.
Yes.
And it sounds psychopathic in a sense, like an abuser who's repeatedly abusing and has no remorse, is psychopathic. So and that's what your book is about, inside a psychopath, essentially. What did you learn?
What did I learn? Oh my gosh. Brace yourself. First, I want to say I don't know of any other researcher in the world who had the amount of access to so many different perspectives simultaneously that I had. Because at the end of the day, he's still my dad. And so there was that part of the relationship. Strained as it was like we were always very cordial with each other. He knew, like, we never talked about this, him and I, but he knew that I was manipulating him, and he knew that I knew that he was manipulating me. And so it was like this cat and mouse, just constantly, every letter, every sentence. I'm an incredibly analytical thinker, and strangely, in a lot of ways, like genetically, I inherited his brain, like his way of thinking, that thought process, not the sexual side of it, but just the being able to analyze things and think about things, and take a rock where most people would say, oh, there's a 3-dimensional rock in front of me, where we're like, all right, what happens if you flip it upside down, cut it open, and, start looking at more layers than what's in the 3 dimensions? So we just kind of naturally think that way, all of us in our family. And so I remember one visit when he was in prison. This was probably, I want to say, like 5-6 years ago. He made a statement that intrigued me. But he said, he's like, never in my life have I been able to go toe to toe with somebody. He's like, I've always been 10 steps ahead of people. He's like, I'm really good at manipulating people. And he's like, and you know that. And he said, I have always been 10 steps ahead of people. And then he gets this smile, and he like folds his arms and he looks back. He goes, until now. And then he just smiles and he looks me dead in the eyes and he goes, and it pisses me off. And I just smiled back and I said, I'll take that as a compliment. And so what he meant was I was now coming in and getting information from him and like kind of tapping him on the shoulder without him knowing that somebody was beside him. And then by the time he looks over, I already had information that I had taken from him, and he was like, crap, because what researchers don't realize, and I think a lot of, or at least they don't write about it because it wouldn't be good for their research. But abusers love to manipulate people. They love to lie. They love to deceive. It's what they are, and it's who they are. So when all these researchers go in and they send grad assists into the prisons, and they ask these questions like, would you say that you groomed your victims by buying them candy and doing all this stuff? And they're like, yes, of course. Why, of course I did. And they're lying through their teeth. They're intentionally giving really bad information to the researchers because it's fun for them. There's no other reason except that it's fun for them. They get off on that. They can't sexually abuse victims anymore. So they manipulate every single person within their circle. And so I had to find a way to go in and find factual information and like kind of back check it against other letters that he was writing other people that he didn't know that I had access to. And so it was like this grueling process. And I'll just give you one super quick example. Like one day he wrote me a letter, and I opened it up, and he's like, yeah, he calls himself the old head. I'm the old head on the block. And he's like, everybody respects me, and I'm a spiritual mentor for all these young punks who come in. And he's like writing all these stories about these hardened criminals and how he's like the spiritual mentor who changes their lives forever. And I'm just rolling my eye. I'm reading this, and I'm like, you're so full of crap. And then one of my brothers calls me, who my dad was writing letters to, and he's like almost in tears. And he's like, I know that dad belongs in prison. He's like, I would never justify what he does ever. Like, he belongs in prison. But he's like, I just wish there was a better system for non-violent criminals, because he's like, did you know that he's constantly threatened, and people threaten to rape him, and other inmates like bully him, and he has to be locked in his cell for 23 hours out of the day, because if he goes out into the gen pop, he's a walking target, and he's living like worse than an animal locked up in a cage. And I was like, what's the date on your letter? Because he dates every single letter. And my brother reads the date, and I go, want to compare letters? I'm like, trust me, that's not how he's living. I was like, he's playing you, dude. Like, he literally wrote me a letter the same day, probably wrote the letters back to back. And they were night and day, completely different letters. And so to be able to get into his mind and like kind of analyze and be like, all right, well, why is he writing this to me, and he's writing this to my brother? And then he's writing victims, and the father of the victims that he was charged on, these little sisters that I told you about. This guy spoke at one of my events, and he's been like really open with me. He's like, your dad was writing love letters to my daughters, and his daughters were really little. He's like, he was writing love letters to them from prison. He's like, how that got past any kind of security is beyond me. But he's like, luckily I intercepted the letters, but they were written to my daughters. And he said, it sounded like a teenage boy who was like trying to convince the teenage girl to send nudies, kind of thing. Like a teenage boy who was madly head over heels in love with these, his peer girlfriends or whatever.
But he hid this seems like obvious, holy cow, he's a predator, put that person in prison.
Mm-hmm.
But he hid it for 27 years behind the pulpit.
Yes. And very successfully.
Wow.
And that's not the exception. That's the norm. And so that's why I tell people, like, when churches let these kinds of people in who have convictions, not alleged abuse, like people who have been convicted, they've spent time in prison, they've gotten out of prison. And I'm like, do you really think that you can keep an eye on them successfully? And 90% of the time, church leaders will intentionally not inform the church that they have a sex offender, a registered sex offender in their church. Like they go out of their way to circumvent the law and to take a public registry and to hide that from the church. And then they do these stupid covenant agreements, which are, I wouldn't use that crap for toilet paper. These covenant agreements where they're like, well, it's between the church leaders and it's this covenant between the church leaders and the sex offender. And we're going to surround our brother and create a prayer team, and an encouragement team and a shepherding team. And because you've been so burdened by your past sins, we're not going to inform the church, and we're going to assign 2 people to keep an eye on you. And I'm like, you're physically lighting dynamite and putting it under a pew. And you're like, we'll keep an eye on this. It's stupidity. Right. That's not biblical. That's stupidity.
Right. And I think we recently had a situation where Rachel's abuser, we know, is now back in the schools. And we said, you know what? It's their job to know, and it's their job to keep people safe. So this like, oh, I didn't know, whoops, doesn't cut it when you're talking about somebody that has multiple offenses.
Yeah.
Now, one question I have is about the how long it took to actually get a conviction before, when charges were pressed, and then the trial and that kind of thing, because we know a good amount of abusers who went to the police and it ended up being stopped somewhere along the way, whether the police said, oh, can't do anything, or after investigations, things got lost, or, it's not always that an abuser gets a conviction. So I'd love to hear about that process.
Yeah. So it really, and I feel horrible that so many people don't get the justice that we got, because what we got, I feel like it was deserved. Not just for us, but especially for his victims. That was the least that an investigator could do. And we, again, and this didn't happen because Detective Beckner was a family friend. This happened because this is who she is. And she treats every case the same. And at first, Mom and I were speaking in hypotheticals, because it's still like trying to wrap your mind around this whole thing and reporting, like saying my dad's name. And like, I don't really want to go into explaining it. I think probably most people would get it, but it was really hard. It was hard to report my dad by name. And so we're speaking in hypotheticals, and she looks at us and she goes, you didn't come in here 8:00 first thing on a Monday morning to waste my time and to waste your time to talk about hypotheticals. Who are you talking about? And we still wouldn't give up a name. And she goes, that's fine. She goes, we can go about this one of 2 ways. She's like, the first way is the easy way. You tell me who you're talking about. And like, she was offensively blunt, which is what it's exactly what we needed. And she said, the other way we go about that is that I go into your social media, and I don't care how many thousands of people you have on your friend list. I'll go through every single one of them, and I will probe and probe and probe. There's not one stone that I will leave unturned until I find out who you're talking about. She goes, and by the way, I will find out who you're talking about. She goes, trust me on that one. She said, I'll stake my career on that one. Wow. And so we were like, okay, we'll go about it the easy way. And so we told her, and then she called him in for questioning. And it was, I want to say, it was less than 4 weeks after that, which seemed like an eternity for us, until he was actually arrested. And then once he was arrested, he was put in county jail. So that would have been like September of 2011. And then it was June of 2012, actually right the week of the Jerry Sandusky trial, was when my dad's sentencing was. So we were fortunate in that regard too, because all eyes nationwide were on Jerry Sandusky. Mm-hmm. And so this was like I mean, it was in the newspaper, but even our local paper, it didn't make the front page. It was like buried because Jerry Sandusky was everywhere. That Jerry Sandusky was front page everywhere nationwide. And so, yeah, I mean, it took less than 4 weeks till he was arrested from the time we reported, and less than a year from the time we reported till he was sentenced and shipped off to prison for the rest of his life.
Did your dad have any supporters? Anybody who stood up for him? And
that was kind of an interesting thing too. And I think this is where we've got to get the narrative right. In my church, I allowed zero tolerance for any supporters of his. And I made that crystal clear. I was like, this is what the alleged crimes are. I was like, I can't give you details at this point. I said, but it's alleged that he sexually assaulted very young children, prepubescent children. And I said, all I can tell you at this point is that the allegations are true. I've heard things with my own ears. Do not even think about defending him. This is not a mistake. This is not a mistake. I was like, trust me, you don't want to go down that road of defending him. And I was like, for the sake of my family, don't talk about what a good guy he was and all the ministry that he did. And he baptized me and baptized my family. I was like, don't go down that road with me. I was like, because it ain't going to happen. Not going to happen here. And nobody did. He's had his supporters kind of in the community, just a small handful, but mostly just like people reminiscing, like, hey, I remember when, me and your dad went on this camping trip. And I was like, yeah, not really interested in hearing it. But, as far as like people rushing to his side, did not happen, period. Which was another blessing,
Yeah.
So in every regard, we had what the majority of victims never get.
And before Rachel asks her next question, I just want to say, I really do believe that's because of you. Because you stopped anything before it could get started. And if there isn't that leadership, that's when there's so much gray, and you do not allow gray.
No, there can't be gray with this. There can't be.
Wow. So what would you say to survivors? Because I have so many who come to me and are like, the church did it wrong. They didn't listen, or the perpetrator was within the church, and so now I have person after person after person telling me, I love God, but I will not step foot in a church.
Yeah.
And that's hard for me because, like, me and Granny were talking about this the other day, like, the church is God's bride. Like, he loves his church. And so how do we, because in a huge sense, the church saved my life, but the church in another sense was a part of the abuse, with my abuser being an elder and all of that. So how do we support a survivor to trust a church? Like, how do we do that? How?
This is a hard question, because this is almost like asking the question, how do we support a victim in trusting and living with their abuser again? That's why the church cannot get this wrong. We can't keep doing it. It's asinine. It is absolutely asinine to invite known convicted abusers back into the church and be like, well, we'll keep an eye on these brothers of ours, and we'll provide shepherding teams. How many victims get shepherding teams? Just throwing it out there. How many victims get shepherding teams? People who pray for them, who encourage them, who stand beside them, who support them. They don't get that. What they get is, you're too bitter. You need to forgive your abuser and move on. And if you don't forgive your abuser, you can't heal. And, you hear all this stuff and you're like, wait a second. Jesus says, until people repent, you actually withhold forgiveness. And it's not for your healing. The forgiveness that you give somebody else is a gift to them. The forgiveness that we receive, it's not for the healing for other people. It's for us. It's a gift to us. When we've done something really crappy to somebody else, and we have a family meeting and somebody gruelingly forgives us, what a gift that is to us. And that ought to break our hearts into a million pieces, which is the point. That's not like, can you imagine God doing that? Forgive as God forgives. Like, I've heard so many people say that. Forgive as God forgives. Can you imagine Jesus saying, these people might not even know that I'm forgiving them, but I'm doing it for my own inner healing? That, I can't imagine him saying that. Like, he didn't say that.
Right.
Jesus forgave people as a gift to them. I mean, the woman wiping his feet, like grinding her hair and her tears and her snot into his feet. You want to talk about humiliating? You want to talk about you want to talk about a bad day for somebody?
Right.
And his gift to her was to forgive her. He didn't do that for himself. He didn't say, well, I'll forgive her in my heart. She probably won't even know that I'm forgiving her, but I'm going to do that for my inner. He didn't do it. He was like, in front of other people, he said, your sins are forgiven. And then he said three of the most freeing words that he said to quite a few people, actually. Go in peace. Our churches don't do that to victims. They tell them things like, well, you have all this bitterness in your heart, and you're kind of bringing a black eye to the church, and you're kind of ruining the positive vibe here by bringing all this stuff that you seem to be clinging onto, and you can't just hand it over to God. After all, Rachel, don't you know that Jesus says, cast your burdens on him, and he'll make your load light. Like, why aren't you doing that, Rachel? That's what victims hear. That's not what they need to hear. What they need to hear is from the church, first and foremost. They need to hear from the church, we are so, so sorry. That's what they need to hear. And then what the church needs to do is the church needs to say, we're going to take every person who we know has a pattern of abuse and manipulation and deception, and we're going to eject them, not you. We're going to eject them from the church, and we're going to make this a safe place again. Until they do that,
Yeah.
I don't know what to tell. I don't know what to tell victims. I'm certainly not going to say, well, just keep bouncing from church to church and keep getting hurt and keep hearing the same story over and over and over again, and just cross your fingers and hope that one church out of 100 gets it right. I'm not comfortable telling survivors that. And so and I hate saying that, like, as a church leader, as a pastor, I hate saying that. But that's kind of where we're at. Like, churches, this responsibility is not on the survivors. It's on the churches to clean themselves up and to get it right. They are ruining people's lives. You know how many, like you talked about people, survivors who they still love God and they can't bring themselves to go to a church, which I get. I completely empathize with that. Do you know how many survivors I know who don't, like, radically don't believe in God anymore?
Right.
Including my sister, Alex.
Oh,
Yeah. And she said, like, in an interview on national TV, she said, I was always taught that God is a loving father. And she said, my father is supposed to look like the Heavenly Father. And if this is the image that I have of my own father, why would I want anything to do with the Heavenly Father? I get it. Totally get it. Totally understand, and I get it. The church cannot keep getting this wrong. They've got to stop doing it.
Oh, that breaks my heart.
It is what it is. It's horrific. And the church needs to realize that it's not a misstep. These are not missteps that these people are doing.
Right.
It's not a mistake. It's not backsliding. It's not wrestling with temptation. That is not what abuse is.
Right. Correct. do you have any idea? I've often heard hurt people hurt people.
No, they don't. You know how I know? Just
Tell me,
asking. Can I ask a personal question?
please.
Are you a survivor of sexual abuse?
Yes.
Do you go around and hurt people
Choice.
as a result of that?
No, I 1,000% agree. It is a choice.
That's right.
Yes. And
Yeah.
my question though is, where do you believe, or what do you know of like your father? And is this how he was warped from the get-go? Is this something he chose maybe through like a sin of a porn, or like, yeah, what
Yeah. Yeah. So I
creates it?
know what I know of him. And I mean, I get little glimpses because again, everything is manipulation. And people have asked me, was your dad ever abused as a kid? And my first response is, what does it matter? Like
Yeah.
I know at this point, hundreds and hundreds of abuse survivors. I don't know of any of them who are like, I can't wait to go out and abuse victims just like I was abused. I don't know of any. Not a single one. Doesn't
Right.
mean that they're not out there, but I don't know of a single one. Typically, the response is, if you've been abused, male or female, a male or female victim, doesn't matter. If you've been abused, you will lay down on the railroad tracks and sacrifice yourself to save one child from ever having that happen to them again. Yeah, so this whole thing, like, it's a myth, and it's a statistical myth, and I don't know why this is still being circulated, that if you've been abused, you're so likely to abuse other victims. No, you're not. You are not. Again, there are people who've been abused who certainly are child abusers, absolutely. But it is a small percentage. So, sorry, I forgot what your question was because I ramble on.
What creates a perpetrator like this? Like,
So from what I know of his childhood, um, yeah, like I said, people have asked, has he been abused as a child? And I say, well, it depends on who you ask. He told me point blank, and I believe him. He's like, I've never been sexually abused. He's told other people adamantly, oh my gosh, I've like gives a sob story about how he was sexually abused as a kid. I'm telling you, as sure as we're sitting here, he looked me square in the eyes and he said, I have never been abused. I believe it. I don't believe he's ever been abused. But when he talks about it, like he used the word curiosity. He said, I've always been a very curious kid. And so he started from a young age, like with baby dolls, looking under the clothes, which is a normal, actually, that's kind of a normal developmental process for kids. Lift up the doll baby's dress and you want to know what's underneath. And well, they're usually just rounded off and blank, and you might have a butt crack or whatever, but like there's no anatomy under there. So then he started volunteering as a teenager, a young teenager, started volunteering to babysit for these parents, these little kids. So he would, and specifically kids who were still in diapers. That way he could change diaper and he could look underneath. And well, that sparked a curiosity. So then, that it was just kind of this progression, and nobody was ever there to stop him. And so, I think it's this warped nature of sexualizing from that young age, sexualizing little children, and then there's no intervention. And all the research shows, like, if there's intervention when somebody's a teenager, there's great hope for success.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. But once they get like the age of 18, 19, once those patterns have been really locked into place, I mean, every secular researcher says we never use the word rehabilitated or healed. Never. Because it doesn't happen. Right. They say we can put controls on pedophiles. We can put certain controls on them, but they will always think about children this way and attempt to make victims.
In the psychology world, we say that at the age of 24, your brain has been kind of hardwired that the
Yeah,
habits you have at 24 are the habits you're going to have at 54.
absolutely.
I am so curious as to how the heck well, it seems like he chose leadership in a church on purpose. Like how,
Yes.
and there was no remorse even throughout those years of, oh, I shouldn't be doing this or anything like that.
Mm-mm.
How does a psychopath become a pastor?
Yeah, I think it's very easy, actually. I think it's just abusers. Abusers are going to find the path of least resistance, and the church, hands down, still to this day, like even after all, Me Too, Church Too, the SBC, the Independent Fundamental Baptist, like the Catholic Church here in my backyard, like the epicenter of this is in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, 20 miles from here. That's where all this started, with the Catholic Church and the grand jury investigation of 2018. That started with the grand jury investigation of 2016 for the Altoona Johnstown diocese. And then there was such outrage by victims across the state of Pennsylvania. They're like, well, that's great about Altoona Johnstown, but what about the rest of our dioceses? And so there was pressure on the Attorney General's office to open up this statewide grand jury investigation. That's how that all started. Even after all that, we're exactly where we were 10 years ago in the church. And we're going to remain there. I promise you it's not going to change until people start taking strong positions against abuse, like institutionally wide, like entire institutions. You can't take a soft approach. SBC, I harped on them from the very beginning. I will stand by everything that I said then, and I'll stand by it now. The Southern Baptist Church will not change. They're incapable of it. Even after all this, even after the Department of Justice now is investigating the Southern Baptist Church, they're not going to change. They can't be scared into it because it's such a part of their DNA. This soft approach that says all sins are equal and we're all brothers and sisters just trying to get along, and we need to love our enemies, and the church is a welcome place for everybody. No, it's not. It can't be.
Yeah.
So I think until those things change, and it's bad news. I'm not saying that it can't or it won't change. I'm just saying right now, the way that things are, look at the statistics. Like you would think after Larry Nassar, you would think after Jules Woodson came forward and was the face of Me Too or Church Too in 2018. You would think after the SBC investigation, the Houston Chronicle articles, you'd think after the Catholic Church, you would think, after IFB, after all these things that are coming out at like breakneck speed, that you'd be like, my goodness, the church has got to be on their knees and they've got to be so humbled right now, saying we made so many mistakes. What's their policy say? They might be saying it, but what's their policy say? Right. Their policy says, if you have serially raped little children and spent time in prison and gotten out, we're going to support you, encourage you, give you community. We'll keep you out of the children's wing, which that's a whole nother topic. And I always say, if there's one place that we should, if you're going to allow a sex offender in your church, the one place you should allow them is in the children's wing. It's where there's the most control. You have kids locked in classrooms. You have 2 teachers. You have structure. You have kids not going to the bathroom by themselves. You have all this structure in place. And once the kids break out of that children's wing, what do you have? Like complete chaos. Like we're doing everything wrong that we can possibly do wrong. And until that changes, we're going to get more of the same.
Well, and it has to be a cultural change. And that starts at the top. Leadership change, leadership, black and white. I've been in
Yeah.
leadership for 20 years, and I know if leadership is gray, I mean, it like starts at the top and then it goes down, right? So if you're a little bit uncertain, your team is very uncertain. So if you introduce a little bit of gray at the top, like, well, let's think about it, it could be fine. The people way down here have a lot of gray, and you're not going to have that cultural shift. So
Absolutely. Well, I mean, here's a question, and here's like just in the most simple terms. And Mom and I, we use analogies a lot. And I'll ask you guys, like, if a fire breaks out inside of your home, if there's smoke, something's smoldering, but then you actually see flames, what should be your first response?
get it out.
Put it out, or what else?
Yeah.
What if it's uncontrollable? What if that fire grows and you can't get out, right?
Run.
Get out.
Yeah.
Would you ever, in your wildest imagination, ever lock yourself, or more morbidly, would you lock your kids inside of a house and say, well, we're going to wait this out and just kind of see what happens? Would you ever do it?
No.
Not a single sane human being on planet Earth would ever, in their wildest nightmares, think of doing that. Yet that's what we're doing with abusers. We know that they're not just thinking about children this way. They're doing it. They actually followed through with it and did it repeatedly over and over and over and over again with multiple victims. And what do? We invite them in, we pull the doors closed, and we have 2 or 3 people. Typically it's anywhere from like 2 to like maximum 10, and that's it. That's being generous, and that's at a mega church. 10 people who are in the know, and they'll say, well, we're going to monitor this person, but shh, don't tell anybody else, because that wouldn't be fair. After all, little Granny Smith, who sits 3 rows back, she probably is a gossip, and we wouldn't advertise that to the church. You know what I mean? Like, it's insanity.
Right.
And so we know that these guys are creating carnage everywhere they go. And we're like, let's invite them in. They're smoldering. They're fresh out of prison. I'm telling you, guys would flip. Like, I had to get out of consulting. I recently pulled the consulting page off of I couldn't do it anymore. Like, the amount of inmates who would show up from prison, get a ride, and land on the steps of a church. And they're like, come on in, brother. Like, you guys are stupid. That's stupid. That's not recklessness. That's stupidity.
Well, and so here's a recent example for me. Person, I don't know how much I should say or not say, but I'm just going to say it. The person who was investigating my case, I let a lot of red flags go at first because, he worked for a trafficking organization. He was a Christian. He was all these things. And when I did finally come forward with the things that were going on, I found out that the church he had previously been at 5 years prior, he was sexting with preteens, all inappropriate, like pictures, the whole shebang.
Yeah.
That church called his current church and told them, because he ran. Once he got found out, he ran.
Yeah.
You need to be aware of this.
Well, and by the way, nothing was brought to the police. There are no charges.
No.
So he went to a new church. Go ahead.
That's literally criminal.
And
that's literally criminal to not report that as a church leader.
And they know this, and they know he's now helping trafficking victims. The church does.
Wow.
And they let it go. And they did say, we will not allow you in the children's wing.
It blows my mind. It's I don't know what a good example of this is. It's like somebody who is a like repeat drunk driver, gets into accidents all the time, constantly crashing into people, running red lights, the whole shebang. Like, just arrest after arrest after arrest. They keep doing it. And we're like, all right, we're going to put you on country roads instead of letting you drive on the interstate. You know what I mean? Like, you're still putting them in the driver's, you're still putting them in the car. You're still giving them access to a vehicle.
Well,
And
Rachel,
the vehicle for abusers, period, hands down, is access to children. And I could tell you probably conservatively 100 stories that I personally know, churches that I've dealt with, that I've personally worked with. And that's not an exaggeration, where they thought they were doing the right thing. They had somebody come in, they had these covenant toilet paper agreements. They did all the quote unquote right things, and they didn't tell the church. And lo and behold, and it's so predictable. It's predictable as the day is long. When the church is uninformed, when young parents like us are uninformed, we don't know. We don't know that they're a registered sex offender. Here comes this guy, and we see the leadership all buddy with them. What message does that send to us? Here's a safe person.
Mm-hmm.
And so that person, inevitably, they're always thinking about deception and access. How do I deceive people, and how do I gain access to these kids? So what's the most logical way to do that? Well, at church, it's going to be kind of obvious. They still do it, but it's going to be a little bit more obvious. And so they befriend people.
Mm-hmm.
And then they go to home Bible studies. And then they start doing things like, well, why don't we set up a time to just hang out, and like, hey, you guys haven't been on a date for a long time. What if I watch your kids just for an hour, and you guys go out? I'm telling you, it happens over and over and over again. And when I talk to the churches, I'm like, what did you think was going to happen? They're like, well, that's outside of our control. Our job is to control what happens here at the church. And I'm like, well, how'd you do on that, bucko? How'd you do on that? I give you an F-, because you gave access to this creep who you knew that he was raping kids, and you gave him access, unfettered access to all of these kids. You kept them out of the children's wing. Good job. But you gave them unfettered access to these kids outside of church, because you failed to inform the church that you have this dangerous sex offender. And I would go further. You let him in your front door. That's where my church is different. We have it written in policy. You don't even step foot inside, period. If you're serious about repentance and you want to worship God, I'm all for it. I really am. Like, people think I'm harsh and I hate abusers and I have an axe to grind. I have a chip on my shoulder. I've heard all that stuff. I don't believe in grace. I've heard all that stuff, and it's just not true. We actually have written into our policy, if you're serious about God, we'll go out of our way and we'll provide, which is a pain in the butt. It's a pain in the butt, but we'll provide an alternate worship service in person. I'm not even talking about online. Like, we have it written in our policy. We'll give you a whole full worship experience that doesn't involve one single little child.
Has anybody ever taken you up on that?
No. It's amazing.
Rachel says often, if somebody truly was repentant, they would not want to put themselves in a situation around little children.
Period. That's exactly right. They would never step foot inside. They wouldn't fathom stepping foot inside of a church building or anywhere where there are kids. Yeah. Pull up a sex offender registry for your town. Look at where the sex offenders live. I'll tell you where they live. They live by the schools. You'll see clusters of them. Pull up a map. Pick a town. Take dice and drop it on a map. And then go to the sex offender registry. Pull up that town. Look where the sex offenders live. They'll be next to the schools. There are clusters of them. They'll be beside the schools, your large churches, and your playgrounds. I mean, is that a coincidence?
No. And majority of the time, if a perpetrator is caught, their sentencing is a joke.
It is.
So they're back out on the streets again.
Yeah. Yeah, it's absolutely horrific. And again, like, our family got what most people don't ever get. Yeah. And, we got swift justice. We got an incredibly unified family. I mean, 100% unified family. We had a church who supported us for the most part. Certainly didn't defend my father ever. We had a very lengthy sentence where he'll almost guaranteed to die in prison. We got everything that survivors of abuse deserve. And part of me feels very guilty about that because most survivors don't get it.
But God has given you a voice of explaining what should happen, what you do deserve, how a church should respond. And you're taking that so seriously. I got a chance to speak not too long ago at a large function where I was going to be explaining to youth ministers in churches, how do you do this right? And
Mm-hmm.
you were the first website that I went to. And just gaining the resources that you have on there and your knowledge and being able to pick your brain simply by listening to your podcast, it's making a difference. It really is. And so don't feel guilty because you're using it for the good.
Yeah. I can't not. It's one of those things like I had to back away from some of the stuff that I was doing because it just was overwhelming. But for the most part, like I could never, from the very beginning, I could not lay my head down on the pillow at night, knowing what I knew and knowing what I didn't know, and sleeping at night and being like, oh, good luck to everybody out there, who falls prey to these guys. Good luck. I couldn't do it. So, for me, it was marching into really, really, really dark places in conversations with my dad to gain information and to understand not just how his brain works, but how, because it's important for us to see how they see their victims and other people. And once you understand that, there's nobody in their right mind. Nobody in the world in their right mind would ever let them anywhere near children. I'm not talking about like putting physical boundaries. They wouldn't let them look at little children ever, period, if they understood even a portion of how their mind works. So that's really important. That was important for me to understand. But, the other part was understanding our minds and how we missed it, because this was blatantly going on in front of us and we didn't see it. And so that's why, I linked up with two neuroscientists, and we've done collaboration, and we have videos on my website where they came here to do a training with me. The three of us did a training on how the brain works. I mean, they did the part on the brain, but just making those connections between deception and how the brain has all these shortcuts. It's always making shortcuts. And that's, they studied magicians to understand the neuroscience of deception. And it was brilliant. It was, absolutely phenomenal. And I'm like, why, to my knowledge, am I the only person who's thought of this and written about it and collaborated with neuroscientists? Like we're living in the dinosaur ages when it comes to research for what we've not even scratched the tip of the iceberg with what we know about abusers and deception.
Are those resources on your website?
They are. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So you guys check out, we're just getting started in this conversation. Jimmy has hours and hours and hours of resources and content and discussions with his podcast, which is called the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. He's got his book called The Devil Inside, and then also these resources on his website. And all of those will be linked below, so you can keep researching, keep learning. I know we have a lot of professionals that listen to this who are wanting to understand so they can spot it. And we have a lot of survivors who listen to this who are saying it stops here. And not only am I no longer going to be hurt, but I will not allow this in my space ever again. And so, Jimmy, we appreciate you, your grit, your tenacity. You are not wavering, which I think gives everybody clarity. And just, you've drawn the line in the sand. And because of that stance, you are impacting not only survivors, but other churches and communities around the world. So before we end tonight, Rachel or Jimmy, do either of you have anything you want to add?
Well, at one point, I was going to ask you, why do you think your sister knew that you were safe to talk to?
I
But
don't
then,
know.
or,
We asked her. Yeah, we asked her that, and we did a couple interviews with her on our podcast, and um, she didn't really have a clear answer. It was she just always trusted me, and there was no reason to not trust me. And
well, and even just after this conversation, I get it. Like, I don't necessarily know what it is, but I know if I were to disclose something to you, you would believe me, you would take
mhm,
action. And like, that's huge. And that's what we need to be for our kids, for our kids at
for
church.
sure.
We need to make sure they feel that they know they will be believed and action will be taken.
And not be interrogated, not be questioned, and like that's the thing too. And
Sure.
again, none of this. I mean, absolutely zero of what I did was because of training. Like, I will say that very humbly. It's not that I'm like this super smart person that was like, hey, here's what we're gonna do. Like, I felt completely overwhelmed and lost, and I was like hyperventilating inside, and I was panicked, and I was like, oh my goodness, what do I do? Um, but kind of on in hindsight, just going back and reflecting, it's not that I'm like this super leader. I hate confrontation. I loathe it. I shut down with like any form of confrontation, believe it or not. I really do. I loathe confrontation. Um, I'm not like this super strong leader. Like, talk to anybody at my church. They'll tell you, like, I'm very open about it. I'm very transparent. My biggest weakness is is organization and leadership. Like, I'm not good at it. I'll be the first to say it. But going back and looking in hindsight, this is all common sense. A fire breaks out in the building, even with zero training. You're not going to be wafting the smoke in and being like, I'm going to crisscross applesauce and sit in my room and, reflect on what's happening around me. Instinct tells you to get out.
Mhm.
It's common sense. We have no excuse. When churches are making all these wrong calls, if you really sit down and read what they're writing about it and listen to what they're saying about it, they have to talk themselves into the misactions that they're taking. Common sense is telling them this person is bad news. Intuition is telling them, like, something's clearly not right here. But what do? They'll say, well, we got to turn to the Bible, and we're going to start pulling all of these things out of context, and then we're going to come back and say, well, God says. And I'm like, that's like really messed up theology. That's really twisted. And we've got to do better, and I was always taught, like, go with your first gut instinct. Could it be wrong? Can you get things wrong? Absolutely. Did I get things wrong? I'm positive I did. But my gut instinct was, the world is burning down around my sister. I've got to reach in and I've got to help. There was no other option.
It's really cool.
What is one last thing you would say to survivors who maybe have tried to get justice or have tried to get support and have tried and feel like they're banging their head against a wall?
Yeah. I'm sorry. Don't give up. There are people out there who will believe you. I'm not like this rare, this Sasquatch that is like this mystical creature. Like, I've met so many people who are just like me. I think the difference is I've kind of put myself out there. There are people in every town, every city, every suburb there are people just like me who they don't tolerate abuse. And many of those are survivors, they're fellow survivors. Yeah, I would say I'm sorry that you've not gotten the justice that you definitely deserve, and don't give up. It sucks that you have to keep searching for somebody who's going to believe you and listen to you and stand beside you. I hate that for survivors. I really do. But the other side of that coin is that there are people out there, and there are people in the church. You know, there may be unsafe churches, and there are a lot of them, tons of them. But there are safe people within the unsafe churches who like me, hate what's happening within the church. So that would be my encouragement, and just stick with it. You're valuable. None of what happened to you was your fault. And there are people who care about you and who will stand beside you.
Amen. Rachel, is there anything you want to add?
I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for believing and caring. Caring about, like, even understanding your dad's brain. Like, I cannot imagine the struggle that was to have to sit and listen. And I know you mentioned to us one time off screen that you had to stop because it was just too hard to spend that time with your dad. But because you did, we do get a better understanding of what a pedophile's brain is like. And that is priceless. So thank you for that. Thank you for your voice and for your heart.
Absolutely. And thank you guys too. I think a lot of times you guys don't get the credit too, not nearly enough. You guys are out there, you have your podcast, you're being a voice. You're doing everything that I'm doing and probably more. So yeah, you guys are incredible, and I hope you keep speaking up.
Thank you.
All right, you guys, thank you so much for listening today and for just taking a deep dive with Jimmy. Definitely continue to check out his podcast, check out his book, and continue to learn, because he's right. This is the tip of the iceberg, and somebody has to draw the line in the sand and say, this is not okay, and it's not happening on my watch, and it might as well be all of us. So have an amazing day, you guys, and we'll see you next week. Thank you so much for listening to this powerful episode of Stop Suffering in Silence. If you are interested in booking Rachel to speak at your school, your church, or on your podcast, then please email openblindeyes@protonmail.com. If you are interested in sponsoring a survivor on their healing journey and would like to donate to Stop SIS, then please check out the link in the description box or show notes below, or you can email stopsis@protonmail.com. And finally, if you are currently suffering in silence, or you know somebody who is, whether they're dealing with a current trauma or one from the past, then we will always recommend that you reach out to your local resources and find a counselor that you can trust, because nobody is meant to suffer alone. Have an amazing week, and thank you for being here.